Hello everyone, I recently purchased a new lapel mic, so please feel free to let me know in the comments section below if the audio quality of this video is any better than the audio quality of previous videos. And also, while you're at it, please let me know if you would like me to transition medium quality into an exclusively ASMR vinyl record review site where I only review vinyl records in this creepy whispery voice. Okay, let's get started. So what I've got for you guys today is Between the Buried and Me's 2007 release, Colors, in two different versions. I've got an older reissue of the original mix on white vinyl, and I've got the 10th anniversary vinyl remaster on black. Now the first thing we need to discuss is what exactly you can expect from a remaster. And that means we need to understand what exactly mastering is. Most of us have not recorded an album, and we're not super familiar with the process, but to vastly oversimplify it, it involves three stages. The first stage is recording. That's when all the individual instruments are recorded. The second stage is mixing. That's when you take each of those recorded sessions and you put them together and make them sound exactly how you want them to sound. And by the end of that process, the album is like 99% done, which begs a question about that third stage. What exactly is mastering? Again, this is a vast oversimplification, but it's the process of EQing and leveling all of the individual tracks so that they all sound consistent across the entire album and sound as best they possibly can. It takes that mix and makes sure that it comes through the various listening experiences. Now that means you want the album to sound as good as it can, whether you're listening to it in a really expensive home stereo system or the stock speakers in your car stereo, or even the crappy earbuds that come with your cell phone. The album should sound as good as it possibly can in each of those playing scenarios. When you go and buy a remastered anything, you should not expect it to sound vastly different from any other version. We'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about the specifics of these two releases. But let's talk about the album itself. Prior to 2007, Between the Buried and Me was a death metal band, very thrashy, heavy metalcore influence. So imagine a lot of really fast guitar work, a lot of blast beat drums, and screaming vocals. With this 2007 release, Between the Buried and Me didn't completely abandon that sound, but they took a few steps toward a more progressive sound with much longer song lengths, with much more ambitious compositions, more dynamic compositions. And what you have here is a really, really interesting album that kind of foreshadows the growth of this band. I would call Colors the first really, really good Between the Buried and Me album. Is it their best album? Not in my opinion. So there are 8 tracks on this album across 2 LPs. In a lot of ways, this album reminds me of a heavier, like death metal version of mid-90s era Dream Theater. Think like Metropolis Part 2 and 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence, which is my favorite era of Dream Theater. Not that I listen to a lot of them anymore. I hear the same stuff that made me like that band. Really fast, intense, technical playing, but with a lot of dynamics. In my opinion, the weakest part of this album is the fact that there are a bunch of really good ideas that don't necessarily connect to one another. Take, for instance, a song like White Walls. That's one of my favorite tracks on this album, and every single part of that song is really interesting, but there doesn't necessarily seem to be a very strong melodic connection between each of those interesting parts. It's like a really cool idea, and then transitions into a really cool different idea, which transitions into another really cool idea with no melodic through line, or at least a very minimal one. If you think about the greatest progressive rock albums, like Yes's Close to the Edge, even the title track of that album is chock full of really complex musical ideas, but there's a melodic through line, there's a connection, a couple of different melodies that tie that whole song together, so that even as it progresses from one musical idea to the next, you still feel like you're listening to a cohesive song, no matter how ambitious it is. I don't think Between the Buried in Me quite sticks the landing in that way, but I think they've gone on to make albums that are much more musically and melodically consistent, that you can hear those melodies that connect to one another in a way that makes sense, no matter how those songs progress as well. So you see kind of the genesis of that sound here. Okay, so what's the difference between these two releases? Well, the 10th anniversary reissue is, in fact, a remaster. That means that you shouldn't expect to hear a major difference in the way that each individual instrument sounds between this version and the original mix. That doesn't mean that there's no reason to go out and pick up one of these new reissues. I did a little bit of investigation on the Between the Buried in Me subreddit about what exactly was involved in the remaster for this album. And what I found out was that the original mix was not mastered in any way for release on vinyl. It was basically the same CD mix and master dumped onto a vinyl record. Now remember, part of the mastering process is making sure that the characteristics of the mix carries through across all media. That means the digital MP3 release, that means the CD release, that also means the vinyl release. It needs to sound pretty much similar across all three of those releases, as well as across a wide range of listening devices. So as you might expect, some of the characteristics of that original mix aren't well suited for this particular medium. It was not originally mastered for vinyl. So this 10th anniversary edition was specifically remastered for a vinyl release. In fact, there is no 10th anniversary digital release, there is no 10th anniversary CD, box set, or whatever that I've seen anywhere. It's exclusively a vinyl remaster, which is a really good thing, because I did spend some time listening to both of these and trying to figure out how they were different. And that means three things have to occur. First, you have to have a setup that's high-end enough that you can start to hear differences in the individual characteristics from one press to another. Second, you have to have an ear that's good enough to really tell those differences apart. I'm not quite sure that I have that, and I'm not sure that most people do. And of course, thirdly, you have to be paying very close attention. If all three of those things aren't occurring, then realistically, there's not a substantial difference between these two mixes. And the differences include maybe a little wider sound stage, better dynamics, which means that the quiet parts are probably a little quieter, and the louder parts are maybe just a hair louder, so you get a wider range of loudness, which is good for a progressive rock album, although maybe not super important for an album that is as heavy as this one, because there aren't as many really quiet parts on this album as there are in later Between the Buried in Me albums, which are a little more progressive, a little more dynamic. And then lastly, I do think that the bass guitar in particular is really well represented on this new remaster. But you also have to keep in mind the limitations of the original mix, which at this point is now 11 years old. You're only going to be able to master out so much extra detail in continual reissues of this album. Apart from those differences in the sound quality of these two albums, the packaging is actually pretty much the same across both releases. There's the glossy gatefold image, very high contrast, sharp lines, almost reminiscent of Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon in some respects. And also the 10th anniversary reissue has inner sleeves that are nicer. There's nothing special or fancy about them. They're just a higher quality. Overall, I think the physical presentation of both of these releases are really nice, no matter which one you go with. So the question is, which one of these should you get? Either one of these are going to be a fine listening experience. You guys know that I really, really like colored pressings, but that's probably the one that I'm going to get rid of, the one that I'm going to put on Discogs and sell off. Because in my mind, I would rather have the best possible listening experience for this album than one that's slightly prettier. And that's even taking into account the fact that the increase in quality for this 10th anniversary reissue is largely theoretical and not something that I, with my decent mid-range setup and decent mid-range ears, are going to be able to tell a major difference with. I still want to know that I'm listening to the best version of this album, and that's the one that's going to be more readily available. The various colored reissues of this album on Discogs tend to be quite a bit more expensive, but they are for the hardcore collector. If you're in it for the novelty, you know what? I'll sell you my white press of colors. We'll work out a deal. I'll give you a good price. I'm going to go ahead and stick with the 10th anniversary remaster. Either way, I highly recommend that you either find a vinyl copy of Between the Buried and Me's 2007 death metal progressive album Colors, or go stream it on Spotify. Anyways, that's going to do it for this video, guys. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more, make sure you hit the subscribe button. And if you like what I'm doing on this channel, I'm going to put a link in the description section below where you can get some pretty sweet medium quality merch. And until next time, make sure you keep spinning that good stuff. What a time to be alive.